some of Wallace's character, or have we lost some of that in your mind in this present political process?
Well, thank you. It's a good question, a difficult one. I really think he was extraordinarily unique, and I think he was a political accident. Henry Wallace did not like politics. He did not have a great deal of respect for politicians. In 1940, when he was on the ticket running as vice president, his son Bob, who was then a university student in Wisconsin, said, "Dad, I think you're getting to be a better politician." Henry Wallace reprimanded him, said, I don't want to be a good politician. He didn't take that as a compliment. He felt that he didn't believe in self-promotion. He didn't believe in the backroom dealings. He had contempt for much of what he felt about certainly organized machine politics that, of course, he felt controlled and did, the major parties. He was never a political party person. He was his Uncle Henry, the turn of the century, was the first Henry Wallace was a major figure in American agriculture and a beloved figure, and Wallace's farmer editor. But he warned, as a former minister, he warned his son and his grandson, our subject, Henry A. His son was Henry C. Wallace, who was also Secretary of Agriculture under Harding and Coolidge. And his uncle, Uncle Henry, his grandfather, had an opportunity probably to be Secretary of Agriculture and turned it down and said, "Why don't you appoint my friend Tama Jim Wilson," who served in that capacity for 16 years, the longest of any cabinet member in American history. But Uncle Henry said, stay out of politics. You can be far more effective from the pulpit and through teaching and through education and through journalism and through in that way. And so Henry really, at the end of his career, he said that his grandfather, whom he just adored, his relationship with his grandfather was closer probably, although he was very close to his father, but his grandfather had the most profound influence on him. And he said in his oral history many years later, after going through this very difficult time, that he didn't regret having done it, but that his grandfather was a wise man, that his grandfather believed essentially the same things he did, but that and had he subjected himself to political life, he would have had the same fate that I have had, because we shared the same views. So he left the Republican Party in 1928, voted for Al Smith, because he was so disenchanted with the failure of the Republicans in Congress and the Harding and Coolidge administrations to affect meaningful farm relief after World War I, when the farm depression was so severe, and far before the National Depression took over here in Iowa and elsewhere. And H.C. Wallace, his dad, was fighting as hard as he could for farm relief, and his great nemesis was Herbert Hoover, ironically. Herbert Hoover, who was the most powerful man as Secretary of Commerce in the Harding and Coolidge cabinets. And he disagreed with H.C. Wallace and with those who were proposing various forms of a thing called McNary-Hagen bill to provide farm relief. And he became very ill, a gallbladder operation, and died at age 57 in Washington. And for many years, Henry A. Wallace felt that Herbert Hoover had caused the death of his father because of the stress and strain that his father had literally died in the service of the farmer and agriculture. So the Wallaces really were progressive Republicans. Teddy Roosevelt was the great hero of his father. Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, they visited the Uncle Henry's house in Des Moines, major figure. And yet they really didn't care about political parties so much as they did the cause. The cause, one, was agriculture. And so when the cause wasn't being furthered by the Republican Party, Wallace went to the Democrats. And he never was a member really of the Democratic Party. The first man in public life that he truly admired and respected and really had enormous admiration for was Roosevelt. But he was a New Dealer, but he wasn't really a Democrat. And that was sort of the problem. He didn't even change his registration to Republican till the spring, from Republican to Democrat till the spring of 1936. You know, he was still a Republican. He and Ickes were the two Republicans, progressive, that Roosevelt had in the initial cabinet. And he didn't even get around to changing it. So he didn't, then he left the Democratic Party in 48 and went into the Progressive Party. And then in 1950, he left the Progressive Party, August 8th, 1950, over the Korean War, because he disagreed with the Progressive Party position that was critical of the U.S. UN action. And he said, if the United States and the UN is at war, that's my country, I'm on that side. So he really was a man without a party. And he had very little respect at the end of his life for any of the parties. But the other great cause in his life was world peace. And he was prepared to sacrifice everything, which he did in 1948, opposing the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War. And he warned quite prophetically about the shape of the next 50 years. He opposed things like the Truman Doctrine. He certainly supported economic aid to Greece, but it should go through the United Nations. And he opposed other major initiatives at that time. He also urged decolonialization, get the French out of Indochina, so we never would have had Vietnam, and get the British out of India. Churchill was very opposed. The British Tories were very opposed to his renomination as vice president in 1944 because they feared, and we have evidence in the book of some interesting things that they were doing in that regard. But so he never thought of himself, you know, really as a politician. I think he was prepared to sacrifice everything in the cause of peace, largely based on his religious foundation. I mean, he believed that in the service of the Lord, for the right cause, what mattered, if everyone's against me. And I think he had that, almost that self-righteous zeal about that issue, and he had to have that passion about it. But so, it's a long-winded way, but he certainly was not a politician. He was an accident in politics. I mean, Roosevelt put him there where he was. He never was really elected to anything independently of that. And he was very effective in his public service. But he never had a real stomach for politics as such.
Thank you. Unlike my friends, the Queens and the Deweys, I wasn't in Green Park in 1948. But my father was a delegate to the Democratic Convention in 48. Had this nice photo at home with him next to Cornelius McGillicuddy. It's called Black Hat. And this is one of the things in the book which, why did Harry Truman hate Wallace so much? Paul wrote some comments.
Well, very interesting relationship in the book. Truman and Wallace had no real contact prior to 1944. He knew he was because Truman had that important committee looking at military expenditures. But they'd had nothing real relationship. But in the spring of 1944, leading up to the convention where he ultimately was replaced with Truman, Truman came to him on 2 occasions and pledged his support for him for vice president. He later said he was going to be for Jimmy Burns, but on 2 occasions he came to Wallace and said he'd support him. When Wallace was defeated at this convention, it's important to note he was ahead on the first ballot. After this speech that I described, and you had this electrifying effect on the convention. I thought here, if I can find it just quickly here in my notes, I want to read you something here. Let's see here, if I can find it easily and quickly.
remind our listeners that we're listening to Senator John C. Culver. He's talking about his book American Dreamer, a life of Henry Wallace, which he co-wrote with former Des Moines Minister reporter John Hyde. There you go, Senator.
Yeah, after this electrifying speech, and you had this enormous reaction in the convention, we interviewed Claude Pepper, and all this is in the book. Senator Claude Pepper, who was the head of the Florida delegation at the time, and he noticed that there was, in this demonstration, there was many of the states were moving around with their play cards, and he said that there was this real movement for Wallace, this spontaneous thing, and he got on a chair and tried to seek recognition to suspend the rules and put the vice presidential vote in play at that point. And he couldn't get recognized. He couldn't get recognized. So finally he got down, and the microphone didn't work in the Florida delegation, and he rushed fought his way up to the speaker's stand, the podium. And the presiding officer was a Senator Sam Jackson, who was a freshman senator from Indiana, who was put up there in charge. And he tried to get up there, and there was a little gate blocking the way up to the steps, and a railroad union man was there who recognized Pepper and let him go. And he went right up within an arm's reach of Senator Jackson and sought recognition. And Jackson said, "I can't recognize you. The bosses won't let me recognize you." And the bosses came to him in this pandemonium and said, "Adjourn it, adjourn it, adjourn it." The organ is playing, "We're from Iowa, we're from Iowa, we're from Iowa." Boss Kelly got people in there to take an axe and cut the cables to the organ. They screamed at him to adjourn, and he called for the ayes and nays, and it was all noes, and he adjourned it. And Kelly opened the doors and let people in, and the fire marshal screaming that they have to close down. It was an absolute bedlam. And the next day, in the lobby, Pepper met the Senator Jackson, and who apologized to him and said that he had to do it. And the bosses made me do it. But I know that had you been recognized, that Henry Wallace would have been nominated Vice President of the United States. And then on the first ballot, when they did get around to balloting, of course, Wallace was ahead on the first ballot. So it is quite interesting to note that it was very close. I mean, the history of the next 50 years would have been markedly different, just as a matter of minutes and instances. How, of course, nobody knows, but it would have been remarkably different. And you asked about Truman. Well, after the election, after that experience, Wallace, ironically, even though he'd been defeated, came out of the convention in greater political strength than he ever had in his life. He was the darling of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party felt very hostile toward Roosevelt at that point, because they felt he had betrayed Wallace in a very unseemly way. And he was a very powerful independent force. And so a couple of weeks, a month later, after Truman went to see Wallace, soliciting his support, because going into the 44 election, they had to have Wallace and Eleanor Roosevelt, who were the two, and Eleanor Roosevelt was all for Henry Wallace. And before the convention, when Wallace went to meet with Roosevelt, he'd been on this trip, Soviet Asia. He got back 10 days before the convention. Just imagine, sitting vice president going over for 60-day trip or whatever to Russia and not doing anything back here politically to cement his situation. And he met with Roosevelt. And Roosevelt said he didn't want you to be, Roosevelt had been told by the bosses that Wallace would cost him several million votes. There was a Gallup poll out at the same time, spring of 44, that showed Wallace the favorite of rank-and-file Democrats. But Roosevelt was sick, and Roosevelt had really been the captive of Ed Pauley and his scheduler, Paul Watson, whom Wallace once observed took an indefinite number of years to get out of West Point. That's what he referred to him. And he met